Hello YouTube. I want to go over a subject in firearms history that really hasn't been covered much, and it's finally starting to get some recognition. And that is the trade guns of North America, that particularly the trade guns that were for the Native Americans. And that is a very long point in time in American history. It started in the late 1500s, early 1600s, and went right up until 1866, when the U.S. government finally put out a law that only the Bureau of Indian Affairs could handle and trade firearms with Native Americans. And even after that, once the conflict started, the Indian Wars, 1870s, 1880s, the Native Americans had their guns confiscated, and by the early 1900s they were no longer trading in firearms to the Indians. They were trading in horses and cattle and pigs and farm implements to try to convert Indians from being hunters into farmers. But in the early days of the Americas, you're talking New France, before the country was even it was just still the colonies, not even the colonies. It was where they were, all the different countries were vying for the beaver furs. And because that was at the early time the first real big trade item for the Europeans. So the Europeans, when they came over, and it was mostly at the early days, it was the French and it was the Dutch. And the English actually worked for the Dutch. Henry Hudson actually, even though he was an English explorer, did all of his exploring. He was pretty much paid and commissioned by the Dutch. The English didn't have the money to commit to exploring the New World, so to speak. The Dutch did early on. Well, what happened was they decided, especially since the Native Americans started seeing the Europeans at first with matchlocks, and then the early flintlocks, the Native Americans wanted those weapons. They realized once they had demonstrations before them of the firepower and what they could do, that they needed and wanted them. And you started having a lot of companies, the Hudson Bay Company, a lot of the early companies started trading guns, particularly with Native Americans. And they had certain qualities and standards. These guns had to meet certain standards. They couldn't be junk. They couldn't be just thrown together. These were quality firearms. They had standards. They had to be proofed, and at first they were proofed over in Europe, and then they ended up later on setting up proof houses here. The first ones, of course, they had in London, then you had Birmingham in England, and you also had the French proof houses, because you had the English trade guns, which were just basically considered trade guns, and you had the French guns, because the French, you had two categories. You had the fusil de chasse, which was considered the gun of the hunt, and then the fusil de trade, which meant literally the gun of the trade gun. And these guns were smoothbore. And they were smoothbore flintlock guns from even the 1600s, believe it or not, well into the late 1870s. They were still manufacturing and trading these guns, and very, very few were percussion arms. Most were flintlock, single barrel, smoothbore guns, because that is what the Indians and Native Americans preferred to use, because they could use them either as a shotgun or as using a large caliber round ball for bigger game or buckshot. And they were produced that way by various companies and gun makers, pretty much right up until, I think the latest that I've seen is 1874. And it was a flintlock. It looked just like it looked like a gun that was 100 years older. But it was because that was what they preferred. Later on, they did get into the cartridge arms, but that was in 1866. They couldn't get those. Any gun that they got after 1866 was traded illegally to Native Americans, or, according to the federal government at the time, or stolen. Everything prior to that pretty much was, again, these guns. So how did they get to one in 1874? That was, again, had to be an illegal trade. But it's, you did see some guns converted to percussion, but most were still your smoothbore muskets. There's a book out now. It's been out for a couple of years called For Trade or Treaty: Firearms of the American Indians from 1600 to 1920. This covers so much of the different various time periods from the beginning of the trade, where they were trading firearms and what they traded for. And these companies, the Hudson Bay Company, the Northwest Company, the American Fur Company, Pierre Chateau Jr. and Company, you had gift guns from the British government. You had all these different, the XY Company. These companies all traded for furs, and particularly beaver furs. And they even listed in the charts when they would sell these guns, they had rules of what they would sell for. Of what they could actually be traded, there was a list of how many beaver furs or how many pelts you could turn in to trade for one of these guns. And then powder and molds and flints and all the supplies you needed. There were also guns that were known as chief guns. These guns were gifts. These were part of the British gift guns. They would be given to, and these were part of the orders from the British, from the Crown, in order to win over buyers, in order to win over basically Native Americans to trade particularly with them instead of the French. Give them a gun, give them a couple of guns, but give them a basically contract to build a very nice gun, nicer than the rest, nicer wood, engraving. These were chief guns. These were to be presented only to the chief. These were their guns, and they were given as gifts. It was amazing how long, because you see Hollywood. Hollywood has had Native American history screwed up for years. That it was, no matter what, it was always illegal to trade guns with the Native Americans. No. It was an essential trade deal. They traded with them for how many, you're talking 1600 on. Almost 300 years. And it was that way up until the end of the Civil War. The Civil War, and after that, they changed things. But some of these guns kind of look like this one here in front of you. This is I just got this recently. This is a Pedersoli Indian trade gun. And this is modeled after a British gun from the early 1800s. It has, on the other side, it has a very ornate serpentine lock, side lock on it. And that was something the Native Americans really liked. They would take those lock pieces and they would wear them decoratively. They love those. And a lot of people think, well, those were a later piece, those side plates. No, those side plates were less ornate. The serpent side plates, especially the serpent, the dragon, however they were modeled, were really ornate in the early 1800s. In the middle 1700s, they did have them. You'll see some people say, well, those were strictly Northwest trade guns. Oh no, they had them in the early 1700s. In the book, Per Trade or Treaty, you'll see one that's in. You'll see a gun that's actually on from the 1700s, and it was 1750s. And Colonial Williamsburg also has an example of just the side piece, or the side plate, that has that. And it's less ornate. And again, it's the 1750s. So they did have them. They were commonly, the Native Americans liked their guns light, and they liked them a smaller caliber than the bigger muskets. This gun here is roughly 60 caliber, right around a 20 gauge, which is lighter than the British muskets of 75 and the French muskets around 69 caliber. They were a shorter barrel than the muskets. I mean, this is a long barrel gun. It's a 36-inch barrel, but it's still lighter and shorter and easier to use than a British musket. and a French musket. They're light and fast. This was why the Native Americans preferred these guns. They were very, very easy to use. And when they were worn out, the Native Americans could trade them back in. And I took this to the range today, and I found that this thing, normally these guns here, like a smoothbore and a lot of your muzzleloaders, tend to roughly run right around 1 grain for the size of the caliber. So say 60, like Beverly 60 caliber, 60 grains of black powder. I tried this when it's 60 and it's 65. The first shot was a little low. The second shot was a little low. Once I kind of figured out where to hold it, because again, it's a smoothbore and there is no rear sight, I got it almost dead on. The fourth shot, I think combination one, I had a little bit of a hang fire, but it did shoot really good. And you'll see in the video when I'm shooting at the target, I'm 40 yards away with a smoothbore. And I'm using, it's a 60 caliber gun. The only thing I have right now is 570 round ball. And it actually loads and shoots really well. I don't want a really tight, super tight fitting patch and ball in this gun because it's a wooden ramrod. You hear horror stories of them breaking. With the 570 and the patch I was using, it's really easy to load. It's not so loose that it's just sliding, it's just dropping down there. Nope, there is some fair resistance to it. It's pretty easy to load. It's a nice load. I'm going to work on it some more. Like I said, I just got it today. I just got it this week. And I can see why the Native Americans preferred this. I've shot full-size muskets before. This gun weighs about 7, maybe 7.5 pounds. But it's a really interesting period of time in American firearms history that just doesn't get covered. And it really needs to be. I'm going to do more with this, and I'm really researching more on the trade guns because it's a fascinating subject. It really, again, being part Native American, this is history for me as well, because these are the types of guns that my ancestors would have carried 1600s, 1700s, even in the early 1800s, possibly who knows how long. I mean, just because and it was funny too that in 1879 there was a shipment of guns that were confiscated from the Native Americans, and even then, in 1879, the majority of the guns that were confiscated were muzzle-loading flintlock rifles and muzzle-loading firearms, more so than breech-loading. Actually, the more modern firearms of the day were third on the list. The most popular, or the most common gun that the Native Americans had, even in 1879, were muzzle-loading firearms, followed by single-shot breech loaders, and then your Winchesters, then your lever actions. Which, yes, I know you hear the numbers game when it came to Little Bighorn and some of these battles, but it seems to me that it's funny that you had so many guns confiscated from Native Americans, and even that late into the 1800s, they were mostly muzzleloaders. It's fascinating that they just kept using them and using them, and it was, you hear in the book, again, there are descriptions of these guns coming in just worn down to nothing, completely worn out, and a lot of them, they would repair them if they could for the Native Americans, and they would tell them, okay, you can either get something new, or they would repair them. If not, they were told your gun isn't fixable. And so once they were worn out, they would just get new ones, just like we do now. You wear out a gun, you want a new gun, you go get one. It's fascinating that was something that happened with the Native Americans, considering what you see in Hollywood, how the Native Americans were supposed to be completely treated the way and they were treated badly. Let's not sugarcoat that. But that still, up until 1866, the U.S. government was still trading with them, still allowing companies to trade with them, still allowing people to just trade whenever they wanted. That it was okay to do that. And it wasn't until after the Civil War that all changed. But it's a fascinating subject, YouTube. And again, I'll post a video at the end of this of the shots at the range with this. and it's absolute joy to shoot. And with that being said, YouTube, have a good day.